Welcome to All Things Work. I'm your host, Ann Sparacco. In the world of work, feedback is an undeniably important tool helping improve processes, develop exceptional talent and leaders, as well as build a culture of trust and transparency. Specifically, 360-degree evaluations are a powerful way for organizations seeking a holistic, actionable approach to employee development. Unlike the traditional reviews, 360s gather feedback from managers, peers, direct reports, and even external relationships like clients or even customers. Taking all this together, they offer a multidimensional perspective on individual strengths, growth areas, and leadership potential. But once you've collected all this information, how do you effectively implement it to motivate and empower your own team? We're going to ask that question today. In this episode, we're looking at activating 360-degree evaluations from all angles. And here to discuss this is David Cohen, founder and managing principal of DS Cohen Associates, a management consulting firm. David, you recently spoke at SHRM 25 conference about 360-degree feedback process, and we're so happy to have you here on All Things Work today.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
We're happy to dive into it. We're gonna get feedback on feedback. So to kick things off, in a recent newsletter, we asked you all in our audience to describe the kind of feedback at work that helps you the most. And your responses really shed some interesting light for our conversation today. I'll read off a couple in just a second, but real quick for our audience tuning in today, be sure you're subscribed to our weekly newsletter. It's linked in our episode description. Your responses to our question of the week could be featured in an upcoming episode. All right, so Carolyn from Nebraska weighed in. She told us, quote, constructive feedback that has clear, actionable next steps is the most helpful. It gives her a framework for how to proceed versus just pointing out the flaws in her work. And Marguerite from Florida also shared, I prefer feedback that creates a two-way conversation. If something I'm doing is missing the mark, it could be part of a bigger issue, such as blocks I'm facing that would be most effective if my manager worked with me to resolve. So we're seeing kind of similarities in this. So, David, how would you say the 360-degree evaluation really addresses their needs here when it comes to giving feedback that will actually help employees the most?
It's a fascinating question because the results of the 360 feedback is data. And that data is meaningless until you understand it and do something about it. So the feedback by itself is not going to help create what both of these people want, is a dialogue between themselves and the feedback providers. So one of the ways of doing that is to have anecdotal comments. The problem with anecdotal comments is people do exactly what they're complaining about. They point out their flaws. So when I do 360 feedback, and what I've seen others is, before the process begins, there needs to be a training of the feedback providers, even if they're not receiving feedback, but all feedback providers, to say in the anecdotal comments, to make your comments meaningful, they need to relate to your scores. And in order to do that, you need to use I statements or feed forward. An I statement would be, for instance, the person's always late for meetings. And as a result, I feel I'm not as important as other people because they're always late for our meetings. And you would say, I noticed that you're late for meetings. I'd appreciate it if you're on time. It would make me feel that you respect our time as well as yours. Now, that kind of a comment leaves it as an open-ended. It's up to the individual now to make that adjustment. So it's not a negative. It's just pointing out a fact. The other way of doing it is that you point out that in order to be successful in achieving your goals, it would be helpful from my perspective if when you're meeting with people, you did X, Y, and Z, or Z for Canadian viewers. But the fact is that you have to give direction about the future. The problem with feedback, it's a rearview mirror, and it's about what I already did. And therefore, I can't correct the past, but I can influence the future. 360 feedback in its ideal form is giving you the knowledge of how people perceive me up to now. And therefore, what do I need to do to change their perception moving forward? I need to change, at least in their mind, a behavior. What can I do? So, in both cases, I would say the best thing for them to do is to have anecdotal 360 feedback, not paper and pencil, not a computer based one, is to have feedback where they actually sit down with people and say, going forward, what can I do to be more successful? And therefore, the respondent should focus on what they can do that they haven't done, making it suggestions authentically from their own experience. So it's not ridiculing the person asking for the feed forward. It's about helping them be successful. So in both cases, I suggest sit down with the manager and train the manager on feed forward, and you'll have better results.
I love the rearview mirror analogy, and even when you're on the road, you gotta, signal to other drivers what you're doing because you're gonna impact them. And just because you're gonna turn into the next lane doesn't mean they know it, so you have to be considerate, and I think that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah. And when you get cut off, you get road rage. So consider it employee rage, giving them just feedback about everything they did wrong.
Given there are multiple voices involved in 360-degree evaluations, like you said, there's so many different parts to it. What would you say are a couple of the main challenge each person faces during the process? I'm thinking of 3 groups in particular, but let's start with the HR team from that perspective. What are their main challenges?
Their main challenge is making sure they have a policy in place on why they're doing it and have the senior executive support on why they're doing it. So there's clarity, there's not confusion that some people might think, well, it's about catching me doing something wrong, or they don't like me and they want proof that I'm not doing a good job. But 360 feedback is not like that. And one of the biggest problems HR does is they listen to consultants and they make 360 feedback part of the performance management process. Well, then it's about catching you doing something wrong. So it should be for development only. So that's one thing. The second thing HR needs to do, in my opinion, is to have a policy setting session with those who will be feedback receivers and those who will be only feedback givers, and sit them down before they introduce this, before they communicate it even, and take them through what are some of the issues, what are people concerned about, and adjust the company policy to their specific needs. The key issue for all 3 groups is anonymity and confidentiality. Can the person track my feedback back to me? And will my comment or my feedback be not truly anonymous? Because after all, I had once a person who, well, I had a lot of times, the people say, oh, I know who wrote that comment. And I said, well, I know who wrote that comment, but you don't. And they said, oh, sure I do. And they go around and they start picking at everybody. And it really destroys the process, first of all. And because it's anonymous, people should be informed that if they gave comments, they could say it wasn't me. Go to the next person. Well, if it was nobody, how did I get the comment? Well, I have an expression, don't try to behave yourself don't try to behave yourself out of a situation or behave yourself into. And they try to talk themselves out of it and they dig a hole deeper because they become very defensive. So from a point of
Yeah.
view of HR, make sure you have a clear policies in place. Make sure you involve both senior management, feedback receivers, feedback givers in that policy setting, and don't try to manipulate that focus group, that discussion. Let it be a free flowing, go in with what are the questions you need them to answer, and then make sure you stay with that and be careful with it. One of the other issues that I find that from an employee point of view, the feedback receiver's point of view, is confidentiality and anonymity are destroyed when they know that their boss is going to see the feedback, when they know HR is even going to see the feedback, because HR then knows it and their boss is going to question HR, and it's like telling the jury on Law and Order, ignore that. You know they don't.
Right.
So, so the fact is what you have to do is, if I'm going to keep this anonymous and confidential, the first person and the only person to see it is the feedback receiver. But people say, well, then they don't have to do anything with it. One of the policies needs to be is within a specific number of days, they have to present to their boss a development plan based on the feedback. So the feedback becomes real. The boss has to be, in my opinion, in the policy, they cannot change the development plan because I need to have control. The issue over feedback, anonymity, and confidentiality is also associated with who controls the data, who controls the process. And if I want, and we know from all the research and everything else, autonomy is critical for a worker to feel successful and engaged. Give them that autonomy to develop it. These behaviors are usually so closely connected, developing one probably impacts about three others. So let them do that. Now, I have found through my experience of doing this since, I don't want to say, probably the mid 90s, when we used to do this paper and pencil, or we did it and calculated it on a DOS program, which most of you won't even know what DOS program was. We used to make sure that I used to make sure that the feedback receiver also communicate the development plan with their direct reports, because the direct reports are the ones they interact with more than the manager. Direct reports then and the manager become a conduit, a support mechanism to point out when I'm doing something right. They can help me identify going forward what would improve my behavior. The other problem that a lot of HR people do, as it makes a problem for the feedback receiver, is a lot of these now using AI or some form of AI at the end of the report will give a recommended development plan. Well, unless you manipulate each individual person receiving it as to what are the behaviors, what are the values of the organization, the behaviors of the organization, and what are the person's goals and objectives, they cannot honestly make it. So they base that on the lowest scores. The lowest scores might be the least relevant. The other issue is the scale. Now, one of the most common scales is a 5-point scale, and it's not doing it to exceeds expectation. That is kind of like one of the most ignored phrases I hear in this process. Exceeds expectation. If you're supposed to do this behavior all the time, what's exceeding expectation? If you do it all the time, you can't do it more than the opportunities that present themselves. Meeting expectation is doing it perfectly. So they have to do training around behavior. Is the feedback needs to be, how many opportunities did I have for this person to demonstrate that behavior in my presence? I had 10. I think they only did it once in the last year. They deserve a 1. They did it 9 out of 10 times. They deserve a 4. They did 10 out of 10 times. They deserve a 5. Because there's always now, nobody I've ever seen has gotten an aggregate score on any question of a perfect score. So everybody has room for development.
At SHRM 25 in San Diego, you shared a great method for implementing 360-degree feedback called the FAST analysis. Could you share what the letters FAST stand for and how this method can actually really be an effective tool?
Well, it means fair, accurate, safe, and trustworthy. The problem sometimes is fair. Fair is different for different people. So that's why you need to have an understanding in your organization why it's fair. It's fair because it's anonymous. It's fair because there's no negative impact associated with it. It's fair because I'm getting honest feedback from people that's confidential. And so fairness is an issue. Safe means there's no negative implications, that I'm not going to lose my job over this. Accurate means that it's accurate. And trustworthy means that since I trust the people that gave it to me, that means that if it's going to be trustworthy, the manager can't manipulate who gives you the feedback. You have to control that. I said it's an issue of control. You need to control it so you trust it. And you also need to know that often people who really know you do give you the feedback you need to hear, not necessarily what you want to hear. So they need to be able to do that. So it's fair, accurate, safe, and trustworthy. And there's always ways of improving that.
I love that. Yeah, easy to remember, and I think that's the purpose of the acronym. So, okay, so let's apply this FAST approach to a couple of step-by-step approaches to demonstrate how this can be effective. Let's start by focusing on the employee. If an employee wants to be given 360-degree feedback in organizations that actually don't use it, how can they leverage the FAST method to request that feedback?
Well, if they want 360 feedback, they need to be able to trust the system, first of all, that the feedback system is going to reflect their actual behavior. And if it's not being offered in the organization, there are a lot of places on the internet where you can individually pay for a survey and do it without anybody in the organization necessarily knowing about it. So there are ways of doing this. There are some organizations where it's set up to be voluntary. So they have a system in place, but employees might not know about it. So they have to seek it out from their OD people or their HR people and say, is this available to me? So, if you don't ask, you don't know. So speak up if you want 360 feedback. Tell somebody in the organization development group, in the learning and development group, the HR group, the HR business partner that you would like to go through the process, and then make sure that you have that control so you can trust the system.
And what about managers? How can managers utilize a certain strategy to deliver fast feedback?
Well, I think that comes back to feed forward, where they have to sit down with a person and not talk about the past, but learn from the past and say, here are some ideas that will, I believe, have helped me achieve these outcomes, and give them ideas without forcing an idea upon them and monitoring that. One of the problems managers often do is they get too busy. And when they get too busy, they don't come back and follow up. The key to feed forward is follow up. And that follow up has to happen at a predefined moment. And if they can figure that out, and when they talk to the person about feed forward, say, how do you want me to follow up? That's a control issue again. That's a trust issue. You're letting the direct report set the time to follow up. And I worked with my son for many years. And one day, again, when we were flying back from Scotland on a gig we did there, and I gave him a new assignment, and he said, don't micromanage me. And I said, I'm not micromanaging you. And he says, oh, yes, you are. And I said, well, what do you want me to do? And he said, if I don't call you, don't call me till 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon to ask me about progress. And the first time I called him, it was at 2 o'clock Friday. And he said, it's not 3 o'clock yet. And he hung up on me. Well, after that, I called him at 3 o'clock. And eventually I realized he was doing everything on time and better than I could. So I just stopped calling. And he had total autonomy how to do it. So it's about building that trust. It's building that relationship, but let the direct report set the follow-up time and set which of the activities they want to work on.
I love that scenario you brought up with you and your son. It's just so realistic. It really put perspective into it. I would love to wrap up this conversation with just one final thought from you. From what HR can do? What is that simple step HR can take today or tomorrow to go towards this direction? Maybe take that fast approach, not the quick approach, the fast approach.
Yeah, I think that what they have to do is they have to take a step back. And as that great American philosopher Yogi Berra once said, perception is perception, and that's reality. And while HR might think it's going well, those who are giving feedback, receiving feedback, the managers, how do they perceive it's going? And what can they do in order to make sure that it meets all the criteria of fast? Because there's always room for improvement. So I think HR has to take a step back and, sort of let their guard down and say, it's a great process. It's working really well, but it can improve. And let's improve it through those people who it impacts. I think that's the best way of improving it.
Love it. Love it. Just simply taking a step back, looking at the whole picture. It really it kind of humbles people too, as well. So thank you so much, David, for sharing your insights, walking us through these different scenarios with our audience. We greatly appreciate your insight today.
I appreciate having the opportunity.
All right, it's going to do it for this week's episode of All Things Work. We'll see you next week. If you enjoyed our conversation today, be sure to subscribe wherever you enjoy your podcast so you never miss a new episode. Also, did you know All Things Work is more than a podcast? That's right, we're also a weekly newsletter that includes in-depth articles and the latest research from SHRM to keep you in the know. Just head to shrm.org/allthingswork to sign up. Plus, follow SHRM on social media to view the latest clips and join the conversation on game-changing topics that are redefining the world of work.
SHRM.